The number that appears right before someone from your past comes back. You checked your phone at exactly 7:17 for the third time this week. Not close to it. Exactly on it, every single time, as if the clock had started waiting for you to look. Nothing about your schedule explains it. You were not watching for the time. You simply glanced down, and there it was again. The same 4 digits, sitting in the corner of your screen like a signature. Here is the first answer. This pattern tends to surface in the weeks right before someone from your past steps back into your life. And it does not happen at random. It shows up once you have quietly finished processing what happened between you, whether you consciously realize that or not. That is true, and it is also only the surface layer. There is a specific reason this exact pattern chooses this exact moment, tied to how your mind keeps unfinished stories open long after you thought you had closed them. The next part explains what that means and what it asks of you before this person actually returns. The story your mind refuses to close. There is a reason certain people never fully leave your thoughts, even years after they leave your life. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect, named after a researcher who noticed something strange about memory. Unfinished tasks stay sharp in the mind. Completed ones fade fast. A conversation that never got its ending behaves the same way. If something was left unsaid between you and this person, some argument that never resolved, some goodbye that happened too fast, your mind filed it as unfinished business. Not painful exactly, just open. Open loops do not stay quiet forever. Your brain keeps circling back to them, usually in small ways you barely notice. A song reminds you of one specific sentence they said. A stranger's laugh sounds close enough to theirs that your head turns before you can stop it. This is not you being unable to move on. Moving on and closing a loop are 2 different processes, and most people only manage the first one. You can build an entire new life while a single unfinished conversation sits untouched in the background, waiting. That waiting has a cost. Your nervous system treats unresolved threads as active work. Active work quietly drains attention, even years later, even when you think you have stopped thinking about it entirely. Consider how memory actually works. The brain does not store every experience with equal weight. It prioritizes what feels incomplete, tagging those moments for later review, the way an unfinished project sits open on a desk, refusing to be filed away with everything else. You have likely felt this without naming it. A random Tuesday where their name crosses your mind for no clear reason. A dream that pulls up a scene from years ago, rendered in strange, specific detail. These are not glitches. They are your mind checking in on something it never marked as resolved. There is also a physical layer to this that gets overlooked. Unfinished emotional business tends to live in the body as much as in memory. A held breath during certain conversations. A tension in your shoulders when a particular topic comes up unexpectedly. The body keeps its own record, running quietly alongside the mind's. Here is what most people miss. The mind does not forget an open loop. It waits for conditions that make closing it possible, and it tracks those conditions with a precision that would surprise most people if they ever stopped to notice it happening. You did not choose to keep this door open. Your mind made that decision for you, long before you understood what it was protecting or what it was still waiting to finish. What comes next explains exactly what those conditions look like, and why they tend to arrive with almost no warning at all. Why 717 finds you at this exact moment. The number is 717, and once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. A receipt, a gate number, a song that ends at exactly 7 minutes and 17 seconds. It stops feeling like coincidence fast. Numerology reads this sequence in a specific way, and the pattern matters more than the individual digits. The number 7 represents recognition, inner knowing, the part of you that remembers what mattered. The number 1 represents a beginning, a fresh initiative, a door opening. Here the 7 stands on both sides of that opening, mirrored around it. That repetition is the message. This is not a single beginning and a single connection standing side by side. It is a cycle, one that started once, closed, and is now preparing to begin again in a slightly different shape. The mirror structure, 1212 points to something folding back on itself, rather than moving in a straight line. Most angel numbers point forward. This one points backward and forward at the same time. It asks you to notice a loop closing at the exact moment a new version of that same loop starts forming somewhere nearby. That is why it tends to appear around people from your past specifically. A new stranger would only need the number 1, a fresh beginning with no history attached. This person already has history with you. Their return is not a first meeting. It is a second telling of a story your life already started once. There is a reason the structure is a mirror instead of a straight repetition. In numerology, a mirrored sequence reflects a meaning back on itself without changing its core message. The 1 at the center signals a new start. The 7s on either side signal that the same recognition stands on both sides of that start, in the past and in the present. That kind of symmetry tends to reshape something rather than simply add to it. The 2 carries a similar amplification. A single 2 suggests cooperation or balance. A doubled 2 suggests a relationship significant enough to have shaped you, one whose echo is still active in your life, even after physical contact stopped. The doubling also carries a quieter warning. Whatever pattern existed between you and this person the first time will try to repeat itself, unless something in the dynamic actually changes. The number is not just announcing a return. It is asking whether you are prepared to meet it differently this time, and that question sits underneath everything that follows. Understanding the number this way changes how you wait for it. Instead of treating 717 as a countdown toward a single dramatic event, treat it as a description of a pattern already unfolding, one that gives you time to prepare rather than only time to anticipate. The window you did not know you were building. If this number could appear whenever it wanted, it would have shown up years ago, back when the wound was still raw and the thought of seeing this person again made your stomach drop. It did not appear then. It waited. That timing is not an accident. Attention researchers have shown that people notice patterns connected to unresolved emotional material far more once the initial threat response has calmed down. While pain is still active, the mind stays focused on avoidance. It filters out reminders instead of registering them. You likely spent real time avoiding anything connected to this person. Certain playlists, certain streets, certain months on the calendar. That avoidance was not weakness. It was your nervous system doing exactly its job, keeping you away from a source of pain until you had the capacity to face it differently. Somewhere along the way, without a specific date you can point to, that capacity built itself. You stopped flinching at their name. You could hear a story about them without your chest tightening immediately. That shift happened quietly, probably while you were focused on completely different parts of your life. The number tends to arrive right after that shift completes, not before it. It is less a warning and more a signal that your own internal readiness has finally caught up to a loop that has been waiting to close for a long time. This is why the timing can feel almost eerie. It is not that some outside force waited for a convenient month. It is that your own mind quietly finished its healing work first, and only then did the pattern become visible enough for you to actually notice. There is a useful comparison here. Think of a radio slowly tuning into a station that was broadcasting the entire time. The signal did not get stronger. Your receiver simply got clearer, filtering out the static that used to drown it out completely. Readiness works the same way with people. The information was always available, in the form of small reminders scattered through ordinary days. You were simply not tuned to receive them yet, because too much static from the original pain was still running in the background. Readiness, though, is not the same as resolution. Being ready to face something and knowing exactly how to handle it well are two very different states, and the difference between them shapes everything about how this return actually unfolds once contact resumes. Give yourself credit for the quiet timeline that got you here. Very little of this healing happened through obvious effort. Most of it happened in the background, while you were simply living your life and letting time do what time actually does. Two very different kinds of return. Not every reappearance means the same thing, even when the number announcing it looks identical. There are two distinct shapes this can take, and confusing one for the other is where people get hurt twice by the same person. The first shape is a closing return. This person comes back briefly, says what needed to be said, allows both of you to finally exhale, and then the relationship settles into something smaller and calmer, or ends cleanly for good. Nothing dramatic follows. The loop closes and stays closed. The second shape is a repeating return. This person comes back speaking a familiar language of urgency and almost using the same tone that once pulled you in the first time. Within weeks, you notice the exact same dynamic reassembling itself, just with new details standing in for the old ones. The number itself does not tell you which version is coming. It only tells you that a return is close. The difference gets decided by what actually happens once contact resumes and by how closely you are paying attention to your own reactions during those first conversations. One reliable signal separates the two. A closing return tends to feel steady, even when it is emotional. A repeating return tends to feel urgent, like something needs to be decided or fixed immediately, with very little room left for you to think clearly before responding. Urgency is the tell. Real closure rarely needs to happen tonight. Old patterns almost always insist that it does, because urgency is exactly what kept the original pattern alive the first time around, back when neither of you had the language to name what was happening. There is a practical way to test this in real time. Notice how you feel in the hours after the first conversation, not during it. A closing return tends to leave you feeling lighter, even if the conversation itself was hard. A repeating return tends to leave you feeling pulled, distracted, already rehearsing what you might say next. That aftermath is often more honest than the conversation itself. In the moment, both versions can feel warm and familiar, because familiarity does not distinguish between healthy and unhealthy. Only time and your own reaction afterward tend to reveal which one you are actually standing inside. Watching for that single difference, urgency against steadiness both during and after contact, will tell you more about what is actually happening than any amount of overanalyzing their words ever could. What your body already knows. Long before you consciously register that this person is about to reappear, your body tends to register it first. Somatic researchers describe this as interoception, the ability to sense internal states, and it is far more accurate than most people give it credit for. You might notice a tightness in your chest on a completely ordinary afternoon, with no clear trigger you can name. A restlessness in your sleep for a few nights running. A strange pull to revisit an old photo or an old street, for no reason you can explain out loud. None of that is your imagination working overtime. Nervous systems that have shared history with another person retain a kind of physical memory of that connection, stored below conscious thought. When conditions shift toward reconnection, that stored memory tends to activate before any actual contact happens. This is part of why the number itself often appears alongside a wave of unexplained emotion. You are not just noticing digits on a clock. You are noticing digits at the exact moments your body is already reacting to something it senses coming. Your mind reaches for the number as a way to make sense of a feeling it cannot yet fully name. Paying attention to this bodily layer matters, because it gives you real information the number alone cannot. A steady, warm feeling in your chest when you think of this person suggests genuine readiness. A tight, anxious feeling suggests unfinished fear rather than closure. The body is also remarkably specific about location. Some people describe the sensation in the chest, others in the stomach, others as a lump in the throat that appears and disappears without warning. These are not interchangeable. Each location tends to correspond to a different underlying emotional register worth paying attention to. A chest sensation often relates to connection and longing. A stomach sensation often relates to anxiety or unresolved conflict. A throat sensation often relates to something unsaid, words that were swallowed instead of spoken at the time they needed to be heard. Your body is not guessing. It is reporting on years of accumulated experience with this specific person, faster and more honestly than your conscious mind usually allows itself to be. This is especially true in moments when your thoughts are busy trying to rationalize the feeling away. Learning to read that report instead of overriding it with hope or with dread becomes one of the most useful skills you can bring into whatever happens next. The body rarely lies about this kind of thing, even when the mind desperately wants a simpler answer. Why 717 is a meaningful coincidence. Carl Jung spent decades studying moments when an inner psychological state and an outer event line up too precisely to explain through chance alone. He called this synchronicity, and he was careful to separate it from superstition. It was not magic to him. It was a pattern worth taking seriously. Jung noticed that these meaningful coincidences tended to cluster around periods of real psychological transformation. A person working through grief would encounter symbols of death and rebirth everywhere. A person finally ready to reconnect with someone would start noticing that person's name, their number, their old songs, with a frequency that felt impossible to dismiss. His theory was not that outside forces were rearranging themselves around you. It was that a mind undergoing real internal change becomes more attuned to matching patterns in the outside world. Those patterns were likely always present, but previously went unnoticed underneath the noise of daily life. Applied here, this means the number was probably always occasionally appearing around you, buried among countless other numbers you glanced past without registering. What changed is not the frequency of the number. What changed is your own attunement, sharpened by the exact psychological shift your unfinished story with this person has been quietly working toward. There is an experiment worth trying, one Jung himself might have appreciated. Pick any 3-digit sequence at random tomorrow and pay close attention to your day. There is a strong chance you notice that sequence too, simply because your attention is now primed to catch it. This does not mean the original pattern was meaningless. It means meaning and attention work together, each reinforcing the other. The number carries real significance precisely because your mind selected it as significant, out of countless neutral numbers passing by unnoticed every single day. This reframes the entire experience. You are not a passive recipient of a mysterious sign sent from somewhere outside you. You are an active participant whose own inner readiness is making a long-present pattern finally visible to your conscious mind. That shift in framing matters because it hands the power back to you. The number is not deciding your fate. It is reflecting a readiness you already built, whether or not you were aware you were building it along the way. Understanding that difference changes how you meet what comes next, because you are not waiting on some external force. You are meeting the results of your own quiet, ongoing work, made visible at exactly the moment you were finally prepared to see it. Not every past wears the same face. The person this pattern is preparing you for is not always who you first assume. Most people hear a phrase like someone from your past and immediately picture an old romantic partner. The number does not specialize in romance alone. Sometimes it is a former friend, someone who drifted away without a clear ending. It is the kind of friendship that just quietly stopped answering messages, until the silence became permanent by default rather than by decision. Sometimes it is family, a sibling or a parent you have kept at a careful distance. Reconnection with family carries a completely different weight than a romantic reunion. It is tangled up with obligation, old roles and childhood dynamics that never fully resolved. Sometimes it is professional, a former colleague or mentor whose return brings an opportunity rather than an emotional reckoning. Even opportunity can stir up old feelings about the version of you that existed back when you last worked together. Each version carries its own signature underneath the same numeric pattern. A romantic return tends to arrive with a rush of nervous anticipation. A friendship return tends to feel more like relief, a loosening in the chest rather than a spike. A family return often feels heavier, weighted with history that predates almost everything else in your life. It can arrive quietly, through a mutual relative mentioning them in passing, or loudly, through an unexpected message that catches you off guard entirely. A professional return tends to feel more neutral on the surface, even when older feelings sit underneath it. You might notice yourself preparing for the interaction the way you would prepare for a meeting, while some smaller part of you is preparing for something else entirely. Paying attention to which category your own instincts point toward before any actual contact happens gives you useful information. Your gut usually already knows which relationship this loop belongs to, even before your conscious mind has fully sorted through the possibilities. Trusting that early instinct, rather than assuming the most dramatic option automatically applies, will keep you from bracing for the wrong kind of reunion entirely. Sometimes the number is preparing you for something far gentler than you expect. It also helps to notice how many people from your past this pattern could theoretically apply to. Most lives contain several unresolved threads, not just one. The number tends to attach itself to whichever thread has reached the most readiness, not necessarily the one carrying the most emotional weight. That distinction can be surprising. The person you assume it means may not be the person it actually means. Staying open to that possibility, rather than fixing your expectations too early, tends to make the eventual reunion easier to recognize when it finally arrives. The grief you did not call grief. Losing someone through distance rather than death still activates a real grieving process, even though almost nobody names it that way at the time. There is no funeral for a friendship that fades, no ritual for a family member you stopped speaking to. Without ritual, this kind of loss tends to get minimized even by the person living through it. You tell yourself it was not that serious, that plenty of relationships end quietly, that you are being dramatic for still thinking about it years later. Meanwhile, underneath that dismissal, an actual grieving process is running its full course regardless of whether you acknowledge it. The mind does not require a funeral to begin processing a loss. It only requires the recognition that something significant has ended. Grief researchers describe stages that rarely move in a straight line. Denial that the relationship is really over. Anger at how it ended. Bargaining about what you could have done differently. A low period where the loss simply sits heavy. And eventually, acceptance. Acceptance here does not mean forgetting, and it does not mean pretending the relationship never mattered. It means the loss stops actively steering your daily emotional weather. You can think about them without the thought pulling you under for the rest of the day. The number tends to appear closest to that final stage, not before it. This is important because it means encountering the pattern is not what triggers your readiness. Your readiness triggers the pattern becoming visible, not the other way around. The grief work had to happen first, whether you gave it that name or not. Some people process this kind of loss through journaling, some through new relationships that slowly rebuild trust, some simply through the passage of ordinary time doing its quiet work. This also explains why some people experience a return from the past and feel nothing but calm relief, while others in a similar situation feel completely overwhelmed. The difference usually is not about the person returning. It is about how far along each individual actually was in processing what came before contact resumed. If you have been quietly doing that work, even without calling it grief, you are likely more prepared for what is coming than you currently give yourself credit for. The number would not be appearing yet if that were not already true. Naming this process as grief, even privately, can be surprisingly useful. It gives shape to something that otherwise feels vague and unexplained. A loss with a name is easier to finish grieving than a loss that was never allowed to be called one in the first place. Closing a loop versus reopening a wound. The first real conversation after a long silence tends to reveal, within minutes, which category this reunion belongs to. Most people miss the signal because they are too focused on what to say next instead of watching for it. A loop closing sounds like acknowledgement. The other person names what happened, even briefly, without demanding that you pretend it never occurred. There is no rush to skip past the history straight into how things used to feel between you. The past gets a few honest words instead of being stepped over entirely. That acknowledgement does not need to be long or dramatic. Sometimes a single sentence, spoken plainly, does more work than an entire evening of careful, cautious conversation. A wound reopening sounds like avoidance disguised as ease. The conversation moves fast and light, jumping straight back into old inside jokes and familiar warmth, as if no time or hurt ever separated you at all. It feels good in the moment precisely because it skips the part where anything gets addressed. That good feeling is real, but it is built on the same unspoken foundation that caused problems the first time around, simply repainted with nostalgia. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire process. Comfort that arrives too easily, without a single honest word about what actually happened, is usually comfort built on avoidance rather than resolution. You can test this gently without confrontation. A simple, calm reference to what happened between you, said once and without accusation, tends to reveal everything you need to know almost immediately. Someone genuinely ready for closure will meet that reference with steadiness. They might pause, they might get quiet, but they will not deflect. Someone repeating an old pattern will joke it away, change the subject, or rush past it entirely. Watching for that single moment, the presence or absence of honest acknowledgement, gives you more clarity in 5 minutes than weeks of wondering ever could provide on their own. That clarity is not about judging the other person harshly. It is about protecting the part of you that already did the work to get here, so it does not get spent on a loop that was never actually ready to close. There is one more signal worth watching, quieter than the first two. Notice how the other person handles a natural pause in conversation. Someone genuinely closing a loop tolerates silence comfortably, because nothing urgent is being avoided underneath it. Someone repeating an old pattern tends to fill silence quickly, almost nervously, redirecting attention before the pause has a chance to hold any real weight. That reflex alone can tell you which version of the story you are standing inside. Why it tends to happen around certain dates. Reappearances connected to this pattern rarely land on a completely random day. Look closely at the calendar and a quiet structure tends to emerge, one that most people never notice until it is pointed out directly. Anniversaries carry more weight than conscious memory usually admits. The month you met. The season everything ended. Even a specific date neither of you would ever say out loud is significant, yet somehow the body keeps its own private calendar running in the background, regardless of whether the mind consciously tracks it. Major life transitions do the same work from a different angle. A move to a new home, a job ending, a relationship shifting shape. These transitions loosen the psychological structures that normally keep old material filed away, which is exactly why unresolved threads tend to surface most strongly during periods of change, rather than during stable, uneventful stretches. Both of you are usually moving through some version of this timing simultaneously, even without any contact between you. That is part of what makes the reunion feel oddly synchronized rather than accidental, because two nervous systems shaped by the same shared history often shift through comparable transitions on overlapping timelines. This does not mean fate engineered the moment. It means two people whose lives were once woven together tend to experience loosely parallel emotional seasons, and those seasons occasionally align closely enough to make reconnection more likely during specific windows than others. Recognizing this pattern in your own life can help you understand the timing. Notice the anniversaries you quietly still track, and the transitions currently reshaping your days. Together, they explain why now, instead of any other point over the past several years, is when this return is finally arriving. There is also a slower, less obvious rhythm running underneath these individual dates. Relationships that ended without full resolution often carry an unspoken timeline of their own, roughly the length of time it takes most people to fully process a loss of that particular size. For some connections, that timeline runs a year or two. For deeper ones, it can run considerably longer. Checking how much time has actually passed since contact ended can offer a rough sense of where you currently sit along that timeline, even without any precise formula to rely on. None of this needs to be treated as a strict countdown. It works better as a loose map, one that helps the timing make sense in hindsight, rather than one you should try to predict too precisely in advance. Meeting them as a different person. Whatever version of you existed the last time this person was fully present in your life, no longer exists in exactly the same form. Time changes people in small, cumulative ways that are easy to overlook until a familiar face makes the contrast suddenly visible. This matters because the old dynamic between you was built by two specific people, in a specific configuration, responding to each other's specific patterns. If either of you has genuinely changed since then, that original configuration cannot simply resume unchanged. Something in the equation is different now, whether either of you consciously names it or not. Boundaries you did not have the language for last time often become available now, almost without effort. A limit that once felt impossible to state clearly can now arrive calmly, because the fear that used to block it has quietly lost its grip somewhere along the way. This is not coldness. It is what growth actually looks like in practice, rather than in theory. A person who has done real internal work does not need to prove that growth through distance or through punishment. They simply show up differently, and the difference speaks for itself without requiring an announcement. Watch for how naturally new boundaries arrive in this reunion, compared to how forced and effortful boundaries once felt with this same person. Ease is usually a sign that the boundary reflects who you actually are now, rather than a defensive wall built out of leftover fear. If old boundaries still feel just as difficult to hold as they always did, that is useful information too. It may mean the readiness the number signaled has more layers left to work through before this return can unfold safely. There is no shame in that discovery. Readiness rarely arrives all at once, evenly distributed across every part of a relationship. You might be fully ready to reconnect emotionally while still needing more time to hold a specific, practical boundary with confidence. Notice which boundaries come easily and which still require conscious effort. That map tells you exactly where the remaining work sits, which is far more useful than assuming you are either completely ready or not ready at all. It also helps to remember that boundaries are not a test you either pass or fail on the first attempt. A boundary you struggle to hold in the first conversation can steady itself by the third or fourth, once the initial nervousness of reconnection settles down. Give yourself room to adjust as you go, rather than treating one early stumble as proof that nothing has really changed. Growth rarely announces itself cleanly. It usually shows up gradually, through small corrections made in real time. The mirror. This person carries. People from your past serve a function almost nobody else in your life can replicate. They knew an earlier version of you, and standing next to them makes the distance you have traveled since then impossible to ignore. A new person in your life only ever sees who you are now. They have no baseline for comparison, no earlier stretch of your life to measure against. Someone returning from your past carries that baseline with them automatically, whether either of you mentions it directly or not. This is part of why these reunions can feel so disorienting, even when nothing dramatic happens. You are not just meeting them again. You are meeting an old reflection of yourself alongside the current one, and the gap between those two versions becomes visible in a way it rarely is during ordinary daily life. Sometimes that reflection is reassuring. You notice how much steadier you are now, how much less certain triggers affect you, how differently you would respond to old conflicts if they happened today. The contrast confirms growth you may have underestimated while living through it slowly, day by day. Other times the reflection is uncomfortable. You notice old patterns still activating faster than you expected, old insecurities surfacing with more force than you assumed you had already outgrown. That discomfort is not failure. It is simply information about which parts of the earlier work are complete, and which parts are still quietly ongoing. Either way, this mirror function explains part of why the number tends to arrive attached specifically to people from your past, rather than to strangers. Strangers cannot reflect your growth back to you. Only someone who remembers the earlier version of you can offer that particular kind of clarity. It is worth preparing for both possibilities before contact resumes. Decide quietly and in advance that you will treat whatever the mirror shows you as useful information, rather than as a verdict on your worth. Growth is rarely linear or complete. Seeing an old pattern flicker back to life for a moment does not erase the progress you have made. It simply marks a spot still worth paying attention to, nothing more dramatic than that. Some people find it useful to keep a private note of what the mirror reveals, even briefly, right after the first real conversation. Writing down what surprised you, what felt steadier than expected, what still stung more than you predicted, turns a vague impression into something you can actually track over time. That record becomes valuable later, especially if the relationship continues. It lets you compare your reaction now with your reaction months from now, giving you real evidence of growth instead of only a feeling you have to take on faith. The same story, told a second time. It helps to remember that this person has also been living an entire life apart from you. That life was shaped by their own experiences, their own losses, their own quiet growth that you were not present to witness firsthand. It is easy to freeze someone from your past in the exact shape they held the last time you saw them, as though they paused entirely the moment contact stopped. That freeze frame is rarely accurate. People keep changing even without an audience watching, and the person reappearing now is not the same person who left. This works in both directions. You are also not the same person they last knew, even in ways you may not fully notice about yourself day to day. The reunion happening now is between two updated people, not a direct continuation of an old unfinished scene picking back up exactly where it stopped. Holding that truth loosely, rather than gripping tightly to old assumptions about who this person is, keeps you from reacting to a version of them that no longer fully exists. It also keeps you from performing an old version of yourself out of habit, simply because that role feels familiar in their presence. The healthiest version of this return treats the history honestly, without treating it as a script that must be replayed exactly. What happened before matters, and it deserves acknowledgement. But it does not have to dictate every line of what happens next between two people, who have both continued growing separately since then. Approaching the reunion this way, curious rather than certain, tends to produce the outcomes that actually honor the number's real message. A closing loop, rather than a repeating one. Curiosity also protects you from a common trap. The temptation to test this person against a memory rather than meeting them as they actually are now. Memories are frozen. People are not. Holding both truths at once tends to make the entire reunion feel less like a reenactment and more like something genuinely new. This applies to how you see yourself in the exchange as well. It is easy to slip into an old role automatically, the peacekeeper, the one who always apologizes first, the one who used to chase reassurance. These roles can activate out of habit long after they stopped fitting who you actually are. Noticing when an old role starts running on autopilot gives you a chance to consciously choose something different instead. That choice, small as it might feel in the moment, is often what separates a genuine new beginning from a familiar rerun of the first. Do not rush what is already in motion. Once you understand what this number tends to signal, a strong temptation follows almost immediately. If it means this person is coming back, why not reach out first and simply move the timeline forward yourself? Resist that pull, at least until you understand what it actually costs. Forcing contact before the natural window arrives tends to recreate the exact urgency that separates a healthy return from a repeating pattern discussed earlier. Reaching out from anxious impatience puts you back into the same emotional posture that once defined the relationship's more difficult moments. The readiness this pattern signals is not only about you, it reflects a convergence, your own internal timeline lining up with theirs closely enough for reconnection to unfold naturally, without either person needing to chase the other into position. Pushing the timeline forward artificially skips that convergence. You may end up talking to someone who has not yet reached the same readiness you have, and the conversation absorbs the weight of your urgency instead of resting on mutual, settled ground. This does not mean doing nothing forever. It means noticing the difference between quiet readiness and anxious urgency inside your own chest before you act. Readiness feels calm, almost patient, willing to let the moment arrive on its own schedule. Urgency feels like a countdown, insisting that contact happen today or the chance disappears. If what you feel is calm readiness, trust it, and let normal life continue moving forward exactly as it already has been. The number is not asking you to chase anything. It is simply letting you know that something already set in motion is getting close to arriving on its own. Patience here is not passivity. You are not doing nothing while you wait. You are living your life fully, staying present in your current relationships and commitments, while a separate thread quietly continues moving toward its own natural resolution in the background. That kind of patience tends to be rewarded, not because waiting has any magic of its own. It works because it keeps you from adding new complications to a story that is already complicated enough on its own terms. There is also a quieter benefit to this kind of restraint. It preserves your own dignity in the process. Reaching out from urgency can leave you replaying the message you sent, wondering how it landed, watching for a reply with a kind of anxious attention that rarely feels good. Letting the timeline unfold on its own terms spares you that particular discomfort. You remain the version of yourself who stayed steady, rather than the version who reached too soon and then had to manage the aftermath of that reach. What this return is actually asking of you. Every layer of this pattern points toward the same underlying request. Not a demand for reunion, not a promise of resolution, but an invitation to meet an old part of your life with the person you have since become. The unfinished story that opened this entire process is not a flaw waiting to be corrected. It is simply a thread your mind kept tracking with quiet loyalty, long after you consciously stopped thinking about it, until conditions finally aligned enough to bring it back into view. This reunion might become a brief, honest conversation that finally closes the loop. It might instead become the quiet beginning of something continuing in a new and different shape. Either way, the outcome matters far less than how present you manage to stay throughout it. You have already done real work to arrive here. The grief you did not name as grief, the nervous system readjustments you barely noticed happening, the boundaries that now come easier than they once did. None of that disappears simply because an old, familiar face is standing in front of you again. Trust what your body reports during those first honest moments together. Trust the difference between steadiness and urgency you now know how to recognize. And trust that whatever version of closure arrives, whether through reconciliation or through a final, gentle goodbye, it is arriving because you are finally ready to meet it clearly. The number will likely fade from your notice once this story completes, the way most signals do once their work is finished. That fading is not a loss. It is confirmation that the loop it was tracking has finally closed, one way or another, exactly as it was always quietly meant to. Whatever happens next between you and this person, you arrived here through your own steady work, not through luck, and not through waiting passively for a sign. The sign only confirmed what you had already built. That part was always yours. If this story closes gently, let it close without needing a bigger ending than it actually deserves. Not every resolution requires drama to count as real. Some of the most complete endings are the quiet ones, the ones that simply stop needing anything further from you. And if it opens into something new instead, carry the same steadiness forward into whatever comes next. You have already proven through everything it took to get here that you know how to meet this particular story with patience. That is more than enough to trust going forward.